for coming here today. For those who are back, we're glad that you came. And as I said, I promised a sunny day. You got it. And for those of you who weren't able to make it yesterday, it was your most remarkable day. I can't tell you what happened, but you can watch it on the video. So please do. And are we going to strike the podium? Just because. So we're pleased this morning to have a conversation on energy transition and the global energy value chain. We have three great panelists: Andy Geisbühler, the Advisory Director of BVG Associates and the Country Manager for Renewables US, so the Norwegian Energy Partners. We have James McGall, who's a member of the Resources and Sustainability Group, Strategic Energy Analysis Center at NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, part of the U.S. Department of Energy. And then we have Mary Rose, I'm going to kill your name, Valadares. I'm on a roll with names this past couple days. Who's the General Manager of the IEA Hydrogen Technology Collaboration Program. So we're going to each panelist has about 5 minutes. Want to make this an engaging conversation. So after each gives their introductory remarks, we open it up to some quick questions if you have something specific for them. And I probably will have some questions as well. And then after we get through everybody, we'll have a broader conversation. So we're going to go alphabetically. So we'll start with Andy. So.
Thank you. My slides. All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Very pleased to get together. I probably stand over here so you can see the slides. Happy to talk about offshore wind. And I would like to take a bit a different angle. Typically, we always talk about regulation and policies. We need to keep in mind offshore wind, we're talking 200 gigawatts by 2035. If you convert that into dollars, that's about $400 billion. So, I mean, if you look at this amount of infrastructure investment, this is not something you can make happen through regulation. So I'm trying to kind of share with you some aspects, so I would call it 4 critical drivers. So the first is wind resource. If you don't have an attractive wind resource, then of course you don't have a business case. So you see the fields in red. These are the areas where you have relatively strong winds and reasonable water depth. So you can see we have the east coast of the U.S., Argentina, of course Asia, Australia, and Europe. Now you pair that with population, because the beauty of offshore wind is that you couple the energy resource right offshore a populated area. So there you see the population, and I think that's pretty well known where the majority of the people live. Coastal population is really the driver. So this is the basic concept of having a business case. The next element is, how does it compare from a power pricing point of view? I have here 2 aspects. The levelized cost of energy, that's pretty much the return you need to generate over the lifetime of a project to make it economically viable. So if you place your offshore wind farm in an area where power is extremely competitive, then you have a harder case. If you go, for example, in the northeastern US, Boston area, power prices peak, and therefore you have an extremely strong business case combined with heavily populated areas, combined with a strong wind resource. Also on your right, and these graphs are just kind of illustrative. It's not that we would go into details, but you see how the wind curve has been coming down, very much thanks to the leadership Europe has taken to really get the cost base down and to make this energy source competitive. Then the next element, which is probably one of the core drivers, that's the industrial base and the supply chain actually supporting this massive industry. And it's just for illustration, you see one of the Norwegian installation vessels. You see fully assembled towers which are loaded on the vessel and then brought out to the wind area to be installed. Industrial base is absolutely critical. And it's not just the manufacturing supply chain aspect, but it's also the logistics, the port logistics. So very often you see ports like here in the back, you see certain infrastructure like manufacturing and so on. And then of course we got what very much we always talk about, but it's only an enabler, it's not a creator of this industry, it enables this industry. That's policy and stakeholder support. And both is highly important. On policy, especially to get the industry off the ground, you need favorable and most importantly predictable conditions to get the industry off the ground. And then equally important, I just show here an example of state of New Jersey, holding stakeholder meetings, get the key people together, fisheries, environmentalists, local businesses, that you can draw that together. And of course, a strong policy for offshore wind automatically also provides a significant advantage in terms of stakeholder support. And on my last slide, a lot of detail, but I think all what you gotta look at is we got a growth rate of 12%. Also, what's very important here, you can see you have a relatively steady volume. That's critical for this industry, which is very much dependent on infrastructure and on industrialization. The most important thing is that you have a sustainable business volume. Also, what's of course very visible, that Asia is thriving. So we're anticipating about 200 gigawatts by 2035, and about 100 will be Asia, and the balance will be US and Europe. Thank you very much. That's the introductory slides.
Great, thank you, Andy. So my first question for you is, you mentioned $400 billion. Where does that investment come from? Who are making those investments, and what's the business case for those?
Well, I think the business case is you need to make the LCOE, the levelized cost of energy, work. That means you need the wind resource, you need the transmission capabilities to access the users, and you need to be in an environment where you have a relatively healthy or elevated energy price. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, you got some big players. So there's balance sheet money in there, but it's mainly financed. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the lifetime cost of a wind farm, interesting enough, 40% is actually your financing cost. But I would say the limiting factors are not really financing. There's money out there. The limiting factor is really the infrastructure, the business case to generate the return to make it worthwhile.
Interesting. Any questions from the audience right now? Come on, I know you've had coffee. Okay, we're going to move on. Oh wait, Jostein had a question.
I'd like to follow up, Andy, that is when you look at this 400. I just wondered if you could shed some more light on the time horizon there. What are the years where you see these investments will be taken? And if we even look beyond that, what's your perspectives on the promise of and the prospects of offshore wind beyond that time horizon that you have the 400?
First of all, to your first question about the sustainability and when will it happen? So you can see there's a continuous growth in terms of yearly installed capacity. So we're going to, once we reach maturity of the market, we probably will see something like 20 gigawatts a year. Now, so if you look at 2028, 2029, 2030, and that's really driven by the new markets. So I think Europe took something like 15 years to get this industry off the ground. to reach a very competitive cost base. So basically this erosion of cost, you know, not as dramatic like in solar, but still very dramatic, has overachieved. So that happened much quicker. And now the US, China, and other growing markets, Asia primarily, benefit from that European learning curve. And I think at the beginning that's a huge asset, and then once these economies take off themselves, then they will develop their own expertise. I think we can observe the same in onshore wind. You know, onshore wind, we have something like 600 gigawatts installed globally. Number one is China, about 200 gigawatts. US is number two with about 100 gigawatts. And the interesting thing is that these 300 gigawatts in the US and China basically have been established within a few years, while the European basis has grown over, you know, 25 years. So I anticipate a similar momentum building up for offshore wind like we've seen in onshore wind to reach those numbers.
Does that mean, if I may just around it, does that mean that you will have economies of scale that will accelerate and then you will get the dynamics that will be pushed to that?
Yes, absolutely. I think economies of scale is the key to reach the competitive edge, and it has been reached to everyone's surprise much earlier, and it will probably continue to tighten up.
Jean-Francois has a question.
I'm really surprised by the amount of the percentage, 40% the cost coming from finance. That it seems to me that creates a major weakness to the model, because if, God forbid, the interest rates started going up, that would make wind energy much less competitive. What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I was surprised too to see those numbers. We need to keep in mind that is the life, that this pie chart I've shown, that's the lifetime cost. So that's over 20 or 25 years. And it's of course also driven by the expected rates of return of the investment institutions. But I agree with you, it's a big chunk.
And what are the expected rate of returns on these projects?
That's a hot topic, but I would say it's always, the good answer is always it better be double-digit returns. But I think it's driven by the financial institutions.
So it better be double digits. Got it. Okay. Yeah. Anyone else?
I want to follow up on that. I'm not a financial expert, but obviously return is factored based upon is based on a number of factors, including risk.
Yeah.
And I presume that this 40% that's projected over the lifetime of the project is a function of the perception of risk as it, let's say, certainly as it exists today. But wouldn't you anticipate that over a longer duration that relative level of risk would actually go down as additional projects begin to scale and the industry matures? I know that is true certainly in the regulated sector of the electric utility industry, where returns are actually set on transmission or distribution, for instance, which is very heavily regulated. I realize this is not regulated, but still, I mean, if you're talking about that hurdle being 40% over the lifetime of the project, it just seems to me that you're going to be starved for capital at some point. I mean, that just why is it that amount is so high over the lifetime of the project?
Yeah, I think you have a valid point. That better reduces over time. And you're correct, the risks are tremendous. And interesting enough, we have not seen massive disasters. I mean, we have seen problems on projects. If you have a delay on a project of several months, that costs hundreds of millions of dollars, because, these vessels, for example, you have probably $500,000 a day just for the vessels if it's during installation, or if you miss an escalation round in your power purchase agreement, that also is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But I totally agree with you. If we look at how to further improve the cost base, you need to see where are the big percentages. So that's an area to look at, and I think the maturity of the market will further reduce risk, or the perceived risk. Also, we need to keep in mind, you know, up to now we had a fairly predictable market in Europe. Now we're going global, and at the same time we're going in a tremendous technology shift. You know, and we started with you know, a few megawatt size machines. Now the biggest machine on the market is 12 megawatts, and we anticipate we're probably going to be in the 15 megawatt plus range. So we have new technology, and we have new markets. With some of those new markets have limited infrastructure readiness. So the risk that keeps the risk artificially high, because we're adding these new factors. But it has to come down. I fully agree with you.
Another question right there.
When you're talking about all of the intense, I'm sorry, you're talking about the intense construction and infrastructure necessary. I was wondering whether you have any sense of what the embodied energy cost is for construction. How much fossil fuel has been used in order to create the wind generation, and when is there? How much time does it take before that crosses and you're getting a return, an energy return on that investment?
Yeah, it's a very valid question, and if you look at all the steel, you know, in the foundations, all the steel in the vessels, so I don't have the answer. It's a valid question. I think the same question is asked for electric vehicles. So it's a valid question. I don't have the number on hand, but I think it's a valid point. It will definitely take a number of years, that's for sure.
I think it's a good research question for us at the Atlantic Council.
Exactly, yeah.
We'll try to come back with an answer next week.
Thank you.
Let's move on to James and talk about NREL.
Yeah, absolutely.
James is talk and see what happens.
Okay, talk and see what happens. Or I can just talk really loud.
Let's get just the hand mic up.
Thank you. So I am here representing NREL and also a specific center within NREL that is called the Joint Institute for Strategic Energy Analysis, and the goal of this institute is to analyze and examine how renewables play with the conventional markets, such as oil and gas and nuclear, and basically trying to look for what are the interchanges between the two that actually make sense. As a part of that, we have a consortium with oil and gas companies that are looking at past solutions and also future solutions to how oil and gas operations can incorporate renewable energy. And part of that is looking at it from a techno-economic perspective, trying to incorporate the resource and also the availability of the resources at the site, and then couple that with the loads that are needed over the life of the well. For example, at the beginning of the project, you're going to have a lot of large process equipment for drilling and completion, and then after that, you're going to move it on to production, where you're going to have a much different energy profile. And so it's trying to make sure that that profile is actually matched with the resources that are on site. And so as part of that, the Joint Institute likes to identify that all renewables are diverse. We hear a lot about wind and solar because there's been a lot of cost reductions recently. But there are many other kind of resources that are available on site, and particularly for oil and gas wells. I'm thinking about geothermal, hydrogen, possibly with fuel cells, batteries, process heat, et cetera. So there is a lot available to every site, and it's basically how does the company or other companies want to actually utilize that resource. When we work with industry, we actually tend to see a few different kind of perspectives, and this is just a generalization, but it tends to depend upon the size of the company. So what we're seeing from a lot of the smaller independent oil and gas companies is that they would like to incorporate renewables into their operations to kind of show some public goodwill, in particular to the local community. In the West, we've been seeing a lot of oil and gas developments that is kind of coming up against urban areas, and by kind of going renewable or kind of electrifying their drilling and completions fleets, you can show a sound reduction, you can show an air emissions reduction, and then you can also kind of cut costs if the site is too far away from the electric grid. So basically, kind of taking into that kind of site kind of specific nature of every project is kind of very important. From the kind of like the major oil companies, we're seeing this kind of drive to lead to the next big technology, such with liquid fuels or any other kind of technology increase. So they're looking at it more from a long-term kind of perspective of how do we actually incorporate the future of these energies into their operations. And then we're also seeing service companies, oil field service companies, that are coming to us because they're going to be asked to do this by their employers. So they're trying to incorporate the needs of these other companies into their operations as well. And also from an international perspective, it seems like there's policy that is going to be driving this, particularly from the national oil company perspective, that if the nation is going to be more carbon neutral, then they're going to have to incorporate some of these into their life as well. And for that, the last thing that I'll kind of touch on is that we have been working on some modeling efforts that are trying to kind of take into account all the techno-economic considerations for incorporating renewables. So that's basically trying to look at what are all your sources of energy, what are your loads, and kind of what are the capital costs associated with that. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. So first question, in terms of the overall CO2 footprint reduction, how much can you actually reduce of say a well over this life cycle if you use, say, solar? What are the numbers on this?
I don't think that we have some actual numbers, and I think again the kind of the site-specific nature would actually be very dependent. As we were talking about, I believe from the operation perspective, you can actually reduce a lot of the electricity use on site by kind of utilizing solar for instrumentation or for also kind of to power the pump jack if you're at that stage of the life. We've also seen kind of a drastic reduction in natural gas usage for steam thermal, or when thermal energy is used, or solar thermal energy is used for kind of EOR purposes. And I think that I think the number was on 10 or 15% reduction in CO2 from like the overall life or a project or overall well kind of site. But again, it just depends on what people want to do. I think any company or entity could go 100% renewable tomorrow, but it's just how much money do you actually want to pay? So it's kind of this kind of trade-off of what are your resources, how much is it going to cost, and what are your actual goals at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Other places where it actually becomes cost-effective to make the switch to renewables, where there's great solar resource, for instance.
Yeah, I think we've seen it a lot in California. A, from the great solar resource, and then B, from some of the cap and trade policies that are associated there. We've also seen a lot of opportunities in Texas, where there's both a great solar and a great wind resource. And then not only that, I've been talking mostly about the upstream side, but we've also been looking at, is there a way to incorporate nuclear energy in and possibly use the thermal energy at times where electricity prices are too cheap to then kind of assist with refining it and kind of incorporate renewables into that. So I think that there are also some areas, and we've also been looking at the Marcellus, where there's pretty significant wind resources that are associated with oil and gas wells. But I think for the most part, we found that distributed wind still has some kind of cost curve kind of considerations to catch up. So
got it. Questions from the audience? Right there in front.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. Could you tell us some more about some of these places that look promising?
Talking about California and Texas, or yeah. So specifically in California, a few kind of projects that come to mind. One is this is a project through GlassPoint that is basically trying to kind of repeat what they did in the Middle East of trying to use the solar trough technology to actually kind of create steam. And then I believe that they're using PV power as kind of a backup, A, to power some of the pump jacks on site, and B, to kind of provide some thermal energy if needed. we've heard some discussion about trying to utilize kind of old oil wells for CCUS in the area, in particular with kind of sites that have power plants already on site, and so kind of basically trying to incorporate that in as well. And then we've also just seen a smaller oil and gas company that basically installed a megawatt, and within about a year basically up that to 10 megawatts. So they're seeing a lot of incentives through the cap and trade program for the reduction of CO2, and they actually get to monetize that as well. So I think from that perspective, the policy is actually helping. And elsewhere, it's more the resource that is driving a lot of this, and so it's kind of reducing the cost of generation, and so now you don't have to burn diesel on site. And then also you actually have access to this power in these regions. So I think that those are the big two kind of factors there.
So yesterday there was actually some discussion on this 45Q, or what it's called. Is that an example of an instrument that may drive developments in this area?
To be honest, I'm not very familiar with 45Q, but I would imagine that if it kind of offers another route for companies to actually monetize the carbon neutral incentive of that, then I would imagine that it would be beneficial. Yes. Yeah.
Another question up front.
Thank you. Marrying the first two presentations thus far, how much work have you done on offshore wind together with offshore oil and gas production?
Yeah, so there's been a few projects that have looked at basically utilizing existing infrastructure of offshore platforms and basically just repowering with a wind turbine. So you already have the cable back to the mainland, and so it's basically a very easy way to kind of save money, both from the oil and gas perspective, because now they don't have to get rid of the platform, and also for the offshore wind, so now they actually have that investment in place. We've also seen some basically wind used for deep water injection, so basically for actually re-injecting the produced water. And then also kind of the ability to use process heat to do kind of low-grade membrane distillation to actually treat some of that water. That I think might be beneficial in those kind of small, kind of space-confined regions.
What geographies are those projects viable? What parts of the world do you see that actually working?
So I think, again, this goes back to the cost perspective. We, in another project that we have, we're looking at putting solar panels in the rainforest because they are burning fuel oil, thousands of miles away from where the fuel oil is actually made. So if your cost of electricity is high enough, you can deploy renewables anywhere. I mean, Germany has this very comparable solar resource to Alaska, and yet they led the solar market and still do for years and years and years. So basically, it depends on the cost, but I think that a lot of these regions, and particularly the Middle East, have an amazing solar resource, and they're using a lot of that money for water infrastructure projects and also oil projects. So I think that's probably another area that might be very beneficial to look at.
Anyone else? Okay, moving on to Mary Rose, who's going to talk about hydrogen.
Is this working?
Yeah, just use the hand mic, I think.
Okay, all right. Let's see here.
That is working, it sounds like. So
That
whatever
is
you
working,
use,
great.
whatever you want.
Okay, good. Well, then I think I'll go over here. Okay, so with this introduction, I think really helps to set the stage to talk about hydrogen. So, let's see. All right. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to first talk about what this organization is, and then talk a little bit about hydrogen, because I think just a little bit of background would be helpful. So what you see at the top here, the OECD, this is the OECD. Okay. Oh. No, this is okay, good. Okay, thank you. the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development was created after World War II, and it was created to generate and maintain prosperity among its members. In the early 70s, the world experienced what is called an oil or a gas crisis, depending upon where you are. And at that point, the membership of the OECD decided that it was really necessary to have a singular focus on energy. And so therefore the IEA was created. Now the same treaty that created the IEA also created the little groups called implementing agreements. And these are the groups that you see right here. They surround the IEA. We are connected by dotted lines to the IEA, but we're also autonomous. These little groups, it just takes any two members of the OECD to create one. But this is the nature of the group that we have here. It's entirely a collaboration. Now the group that I manage is a collaboration, and also Jostein's group is the same kind of a group. So we all have our topic areas that we're interested in, and that's how we were created. Now the one that I manage actually works on what is called a task shared basis. So no money changes hands at the level of the Secretariat. The members who decide to join, they simply contribute experts. So it's essentially, it's pro bono, if you will. All right, so backward here, onward. Okay. All right, let me start again. Okay, no? Okay. Oh, so who are we? Okay. Right now, we are 29 members. We have got 21 countries, the European Commission, UNIDO, which is the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and 6 sponsors. There are 2 basic categories of members. One is contracting parties, that's what they're called, and these consist of countries or governmental organizations, and then we have sponsors, which consist of everything else. The Hydrogen Council recently joined us. The Hydrogen Council represents the entire hydrogen market. The difference between where hydrogen is now and where renewable energy was when it started out late 70s, early 80s, is that hydrogen is already a billion-dollar business, okay? So renewable energy was not. So right now we have a huge advantage. The platform has already been established. And, okay, so here we are. We have a strategic plan, this group does, for every 5 years. And we have a vision, mission, and strategy, and our vision includes seeing a world that includes hydrogen at a significant level. And we work in 3 themes. We have RD&D, that's our core business. We do analysis because about 8 years ago we realized that there were many questions that were being asked all around the world about hydrogen, about energy, and despite all the good work that was being done, had been done around the world, the questions couldn't be answered. So we've incorporated analysis. And we also do work in awareness, understanding, and assessment. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about where hydrogen comes from. Hydrogen is an energy carrier and a fuel. Hydrogen is like electricity. You have to make it from something. Okay, so what do you make it from? You can make it from a whole range of sources. You can make hydrogen from, and it's most commonly made today, from fossil fuels. You can also make it from nuclear, probably at huge scale, and you could make it from renewable energy. And in the renewable energy category, this includes water electrolysis. So the sun shines, the wind blows, produces electricity, you can electrolyze water, and you can produce hydrogen. Now, that's the very beginning of the story. Where do you use hydrogen? You can use it in cars, you can use it in buses, you can use it in heavy-duty applications. There's a great potential market there. Logistics vehicles. In this country, the supplemental funding managed actually to produce a considerable amount of market for logistics vehicles, the hydrogen fuel cell vehicles that are used in warehouses all over the world. Light trains are used. That application has huge potential, and it's being used right now in Germany, because who would have thunk that there are places around Germany, in northern Germany, that are still running on diesel. So it's a perfect application for hydrogen and fuel cells. They can be used in airplanes and drones and in the maritime. We've recently started to work in the maritime. So the markets cross-cut every sector and all applications, but that's only the beginning of the story. The rest of the story is that there is an opportunity for sector coupling, and this is really important because we're not just talking about specific narrowly segmented markets. We're talking about the possibility of connecting markets. For example, and this is directly related to renewables and wind in particular, exactly the topics of the previous two speakers. Wind energy, you produce electricity. What happens when the grid is saturated? Well, when the grid is saturated today, often the supply is turned off. You're wasting all of that potential, all of that investment. Think of it. So what can you do to ameliorate this situation? Well, one of the things that you can do is you can take that, when the grid shuts down, you can take that power and you can electrolyze water and create hydrogen and store the electrical energy as hydrogen. Where can you store it? Well, there's different places you can store it. You could, for example, store it underground in salt caverns and other geological formations. We have decades of experience with oil and gas in that respect. So this particular nexus, this is a really important aspect to emphasize, because it's going to potentially help make the market for hydrogen. So again, not just a single silo, but potentially connecting other applications. So after you've stored the hydrogen, what do you do with it? You can put it back through another machine and you can create the electricity again and use it somewhere. Or you could use the hydrogen fuel if you need it as fuel. So this is the brief introduction. And I was supposed to talk today about, oh no, I'm going backwards again, the future of hydrogen, because the IEA just recently released a report at the G20 in Tokyo. This report was funded by the Japanese government. The Japanese face unique challenges because of their lack of indigenous energy resources, and they have been highly innovative and very focused, for a long time on potential solutions, including hydrogen. So they are the ones who produce this. So we have to, this is a commercial for Japan, and thanks for them. And the entire agency in Paris, that is located in Paris, was dedicated to this preparation of this report. And my group, my technology collaboration program, was very happy to contribute to it. So, Lord, here we go. The executive summary for this report says that the time is right to tap into hydrogen's potential to play a role in the clean, secure, and affordable energy crisis. We can help tackle various energy challenges. Hydrogen is versatile, as I already said, and we can use renewables. In fact, renewable energy is the factor that's going to really sort of make hydrogen possible, because the decrease in the cost, coming down that cost curve, is making it possible to utilize hydrogen before, where it really often wasn't. So hydrogen is not new in the world of science or the world of energy. There have been talks about hydrogen for years. Fuel cells were invented a long time ago. But this time we hope that it will be different, because there have been other changes, other structural changes in the energy world, as well as changes in the world's view of carbon and the so-called climate crisis and climate change. So that's the executive summary. Now, the challenges that we faced. Producing hydrogen from low-cost energy is still costly at the moment. We don't have any particular scale here. Although eventually we'll probably be able to build on the fact that the Hydrogen Council and its 60 members have, billions of dollars of market cap. This is a market that's coming, and they're investing in it. But the development of hydrogen infrastructure is slow. I mean, infrastructure is typically built by governments. It's a major it's a major cost item, and it's a big ticket item, and it's built to last for a long time. So governments want to be very sure, and investors want to be very sure that they're investing in a good bet. Today, hydrogen is almost entirely supplied from natural gas and coal, but that is also an opportunity. And regulations today limit the development of a clean hydrogen industry. Okay. So the IEA has identified 4 near-term opportunities to boost hydrogen, in the near term. And so industrial ports. So the maritime is a huge area, and the nexus between land and water transport is enormously important. Until about 10 years ago, we really didn't even think a lot about that, and it makes enormous sense. But it's obviously a place where you could put hydrogen installations, you could put hydrogen refueling stations, and you can help in the future to clean up the maritime environment in lots of different ways, through propulsion power, through auxiliary power, etc. And expanding hydrogen and transport through fleets, freight, and corridors in this country, for sure. Any American who's been, following what's gone on in the last 40 years understands that fleets have been used and are being used also in other countries as a way to enter the market. It's because, in fact, we have control over the fleets and the composition of the fleets. And now we're thinking about launching hydrogen's first international shipping routes. So with that comment, let me go back to Japan, because Japan has been aware for decades that they've had some challenges that they needed to address. And one of the things that they have done over decades is try to realize a dream of transporting energy resources from point A around the world and trading them and bringing them to Japan. So, 25 years ago, this really did sound like almost a fairy tale, so hugely cost expensive that who would contemplate it? But it's no longer a fairy tale. And today, there are a couple Japanese corporations, Chiyoda is one of them, that they're looking at creating vessels that are dedicated, because after all, most trade is conducted in the maritime, we all know that, taking hydrogen and putting it and transmitting it from Australia or from Brunei over to Japan. And so this is something that we're looking at very, very seriously. So the IEA has 7 recommendations to scale up hydrogen. I guess before I go through this list, I just want to say that, as probably everyone in this room is aware, the IEA's role is really to help develop policy, and the vehicle that they use to help develop policy is analysis. So this is their typical format in producing a report like this. They give you a set of, they analyze the problem, they give you some recommendations. So right now, they're encouraging us to establish a role for hydrogen in long-term energy strategies. This has been singularly lacking. Probably many people in this room are familiar with scenario analysis. For example, Shell is the grandfather of scenario analysis. Shell is also one of our members, by the way, but Shell has been for decades producing marvelous work on, well, what if this and what if that, and at a grand scale. So we are encouraging now everybody else to think about, okay, when you do your scenario analysis for your industry or your company, please think about hydrogen. Has not been on the list. We feel it really has to be on the list. And IEA has put it on their list, so you will see more of this in the future from IEA. And stimulate commercial demand for clean hydrogen. Well, the renewable energy industry has grown, and as I have said, and as if you heard from other speakers, the costs have gone down the cost curve considerably. There have been enormous advances. There have been many reasons for this, including the uptake of renewables in China. So some of the things that this emerging economy is doing is unpredictable. But there's other emerging economies around the world that they're also, we're not sure what they're going to do. And they may bring a substantial amount of financial resource to bear here. So address the investment risks of first movers. I have to say, Norway offers us many wonderful case studies of taking the lead and going forward. Most recently, and I can comment on this, with vehicles, vehicle technology, the Norwegians invested a great deal in many kinds of incentives that would encourage the uptake of electric vehicles. And they were marvelously successful. The cost of vehicles in Japan and Norway is very expensive. The taxation was a big factor, so the taxation was taken off. And they've done things like encourage toll-free roads. It's all the wonderful kinds of incentives that we think of. They've done it. They've already done it. In fact, they've done such a good job that we hope that there's still some market left over for hydrogen vehicles. But at any rate, this is a regulatory barrier that they've really done a great job in addressing. For supporting R&D to bring costs down, I mean, maybe who here has heard of Mission Innovation? Mission Innovation? Okay, so this is a government program that's, you know, short-term in nature, but the idea is to really put huge emphasis on research dollars, and so there's now a hydrogen thread in Mission Innovation, which is really actually pretty important, and we're hoping that this will encourage governments around the world to do this. And as I just said, the Hydrogen Council is also now engaged in the business of their own future in hydrogen for energy. We're engaged internationally, and we're focusing on the 4 key opportunities that the IEA just articulated to further increase momentum. Let me just, but we won't go back to that. But I will conclude by telling you this is our work program for IEA Hydrogen. And this is, we were created actually in 1977. So there's been huge, you know, international interest in hydrogen for a very long time, for a very long period, at a very serious level. This particular list starts 5 years ago because we operate in 5-year segments. We're now doing our strategic plan for the next 5 years. But at the moment here, what you see is that these tasks are current. So we have an ongoing safety task. Safety is a component of anything that, any kind of endeavor like this or any kind of machine, you need safety, any kind of industry. We're working on power to hydrogen and hydrogen to X. Power to gas is probably the more commonly understood the analogous area, but power to hydrogen, we're converting it to electricity, to fuels, and to all applications. And we've recently started work in the maritime. We are now working, we have the world's largest R&D collaboration in hydrogen storage, which is primarily fundamental, it's basic research, but it also has some applied work in it. And we're working on analysis and modeling. I just want to comment on this because the modeling component is really critical because the first thing you're going to ask me for is numbers. Well, where do you get these numbers, you know? I mean, how homogeneous are they? How have they been harmonized? So we take our lead from the IEA, and the models that the IEA uses to churn out all this wonderful research have been inadequate relative to representing hydrogen. And so we are now working with them to ensure that the modeling tools are up to the task. And we're starting with the tools that they use, and we're also starting with data validation to make sure we have good data, because if you don't put good data into any model, you're not going to get decent results. So we're working with them on this, and we're hoping to work with our other TCPs, our fellow TCPs on this, so we have a uniform view of the world. And in the very near term, we're going to have a task on market development and pathways to scale. We're also looking at the fundamental level in biological production and conversion of hydrogen, especially now. Increasingly, we're looking at the chemical sector and the industrial sector. We're looking at hydrogen export supply chains because these are real, and we don't really have a supply chain. You commented on how long it took to build the supply chain for the industrial base for wind. You know, that was one of the necessary activities before wind could scale up to the megawatts it's at. Well, we're at this level 2 now, where we're thinking about worldwide supply chains, how they're going to integrate and how we can work with them. And we're also looking at hydrogen applications in primary sectors. You know, there's ammonia. I mean, we've all heard of ammonia. What's the primary constituent of ammonia is hydrogen. So there's going to be a lot of opportunity in agriculture, mining, and resources. And we're also looking at successor tasks in areas that are going to produce the hydrogen of the future, in renewable electrolysis, in photoelectrochemical production of hydrogen. I like to think of that as the Merlin the Wizard experiment, where you take a magic wand and you just touch a substance and out comes hydrogen. So that's basically what that one is. And then there's solar thermal chemical hydrogen production. There are so many ways to produce this, plus all the biological resources. So there's a huge amount of research work to do. There's huge potential. And around the world, each country, each area, each geography, most of them can produce hydrogen. They have different resources, but then the question becomes, well, what are their energy needs, and how do they go about trading. So we're going to be busy in the next few years, and so will the world. So we also have UNIDO working with us, and they're very interested in industrial use of hydrogen in middle-income developing countries. So we now have engaged with us India, and we had our first Latin American member. So we're looking forward to working with the entire world in this area. So thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And if you have any questions, will try to answer them. Oh, these are our outreach products and activities. And finally, there's another report that we produced here called Global Trends and Outlook for Hydrogen. This was published at the end of 2017. It's a less scientific view of it scans the market. So if you would like to look at something that also gives you an introduction to hydrogen and who the players are around the world, in sort of plain English, plain language, this could also be helpful. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I read the hydrogen report last night, and it's really fantastic. It's worth everyone reading. But some questions, and the first one is a hard one. We were talking yesterday about technologies and opportunities that are sort of within an investable time scale, sort of at 10 to 15 years, and then things that look out beyond that are things we need to be working on, but are beyond the sort of short term. What are we going to be able to do right now? And it seems to me that hydrogen has two big problems to solve. First, the hydrogen delivery infrastructure, which if you're just talking about the vehicle sector, electric vehicles have a big head start on. And then the hydrogen production side, where to either get that right, you're going to need a lot of CCUS, or a lot more renewables and with electrolysis happening very, very quickly. So how fast do you see, given those two big problems, how fast do you see this actually potentially coming to market?
Well, there's several answers here. And so I also have a business background, so I really appreciate the approach to investment. So let me break this into pieces, okay? Let's talk about the electric vehicle sector first. First of all, hydrogen vehicles are electric vehicles. The hydrogen is used to turn the motor that then powers the wheels, electrically. So clearly, the electric battery vehicles, I admit that they have a head start. But hydrogen has some advantages that electric battery vehicles don't have. And they offer the consumer a similar experience to what the consumer has now. You drive up to a refueling station, it takes you 1 to 2 minutes, 5 minutes, and you're off. You do not need to invest in other infrastructure to store energy. Okay, so in that sense, we are hoping that the hydrogen case will have appeal, especially in places where you have to drive long distances. Now, Norway is about the size of California physically. Okay, so in California, anybody here driven in California recently? You often need to drive long distances and long periods of time. And in the Southwest, where I lived a long time, and so do you live there now, range is a big issue. Range is a huge issue. The hydrogen car offers a comparable experience now, a comparable experience to the conventional vehicle. So we'll see what happens there. It does need money. What doesn't need money? The California Assembly invested in hydrogen refueling stations, and they've already passed the enabling legislation to actually fund the next 100 stations. Okay, the funding isn't in place, but the enabling legislation is. So there you go, that part of it. And I referred to the logistics vehicles, the little hydrogen warehouse vehicles. This is an excellent example of how if you target specific applications that have real depth of market, in a short period you can make a real dent. In that market, actually, the hydrogen vehicles are the hydrogen refueling, logistics movers, the thing movers, are more, they're more popular than battery vehicles. The return on investment is higher. They're more efficient. Takes less time. You just refuel and go. Whereas otherwise you have to change out the battery. So this is an example of so sometimes niche markets may make a difference for us. So on the example of wind energy, all this offshore wind energy that's going to go up very soon is going to need storage. Where are they going to put all the electricity that is produced? It won't immediately be taken up by the grid, and or the grids in Europe. The grid in Europe is not completely interrelated. So it's not like you can just ship it off. You know, if you can produce it in the North Sea and ship it off someplace else necessarily. So hydrogen storage represents something that you can do to really capitalize on renewables. And 15 years, I know it's for investors it sounds like a long time horizon, but 15 years I think we can get a lot done in that time, especially when we have bearing down on us what the world has come to view as an existential crisis in climate change. And the IPCC reports say we have 12 years, okay? Well, how are we going to do this? We now have a compelling argument that has broad currency with publics around the world about the need to do something. And so hydrogen can function not, because it's made from something, just like electricity, it can function as a grid balancer. It can function to actually fuel your cars. It can function in heavy-duty vehicle applications. This is a place, California is going to invest in that. And a lot of the Volkswagen money is going into California into heavy-duty hydrogen vehicles. So I think that's probably going to be the currency investment, the investment that we need there. But I don't think you can discount climate change. And this is the oil and gas industry we're working with. And the oil and gas industry has also evolved over the years. And it's evolved to the point where we now have an opportunity for a partnership with hydrogen. So, I mean, I think that this is going to come from a lot of different places, and not just tell me if you meet my requirement of 4 to 6 year return on investment, or 10 to 15. I think it's going to be much more complex, and I think that the multilaterals are going to invest as well. China's already invested. Brunei is there. Brunei and Australia they're working on building these vessels to transport hydrogen.
Andy, what are your thoughts on this? Mary Rose mentioned wind and the need to store all that energy that might not be able to be taken up by the grid at any given moment. Or what is the wind community talking about when do they talk about hydrogen?
Well, the good news for this panel is that I totally agree. Electrification is clear, that's happening. It's also clear we need storage. And as you see in general in energy policy or whatever you do, it's never good to have a monoculture. So that means just to concentrate on battery storage now for vehicles, for storage, for grid storage. It's a good way to do it, but it's not healthy to have one solution. So I think this really offers a tremendous alternative to build a different type of storage with a different characteristic. It's not just that you would put a hydrogen powered or technology storage next to an electrical one. You can apply it differently. Because if you look at the offshore wind challenge, a big cost is interconnection. And you got two problems. You have one problem, you need the cable, which is extremely expensive. And the second challenge, which is equally challenging, is you need an interconnection point. That means you need to have a coastal area where you have sufficient capability to accept the power. And in some, for example, for New York, that's a big challenge now, targeting the 9 gigawatts. That's a big challenge. So with hydrogen, I mean, this is probably territory for lots of new studies. If you are independent of a grid and independent of a need for a cable, you can build your wind farm pretty much wherever you like, where it's in no one's way, where you have fantastic wind regime. We're anyway seeing the trend to floating, so the need to be in, let's say, 50 to 60 meter water that trend is going away because we're migrating into floating. So that would actually decouple the challenge of having interconnection and transmission cost and challenges, and allow us to much more freely distribute the power. So I think it's a great opportunity.
So where do you think is going to be the breakthrough in hydrogen? What sector? You listed a number of different opportunities. Where will we see the breakthrough that really makes this commercially viable?
That's a very difficult question for a number of reasons, because it depends upon government will, it depends upon investment, and there's a number of externalities, like who knows what some of the emerging economies will do? Who knows what China will do next? You know, I mean, I can't answer that with any level of certainty, period. But in California and around the world, and I think there's an agreement that the heavy-duty vehicle markets are perhaps ripe for hydrogen. And once you get the hydrogen refueling stations for the heavy-duty vehicles, then it's a short step to the passenger vehicles, or it's a shorter step. Plus, then there's the maritime. Now, I mean, these are not easy questions. I mean, I don't want you to think when you leave here that we're just going to put a fuel cell in every boat and it's going to go. You know. But there are clearly opportunities in the maritime. I mean, this is a huge sector with a huge amount of investment in it. So we should look at that.
And the IMO has very, very aggressive decarbonization targets that are hard to meet with. You could meet them if you switch the whole fleet to LNG, for instance. So you've got to have other technological solutions. So hydrogen could be one of those.
And you know, this just I'm reminded of World War I. And the oil and gas industry, the story about how Royal Dutch Shell worked for years and years on a man named Winston Churchill to try to get him to convert his fleet from coal to oil. Remember that story? You know, and Winston Churchill was the only one listening at that point. But when it came near World War I time, he made sure that they converted, because he just said, we're not going to win this war on coal. We're going to have to convert to oil. And so you just don't know what's coming next. You know, we may have other kinds of needs. But certainly the world has a lot of energy choices now.
Questions from the audience? There's a whole bunch. Okay.
Thank you very much for a very informative presentation. You mentioned that there's still a need for substantial research and development, and I was just wondering if you had an idea where in the hydrogen value chain they think that the need would be the greatest. And also I wonder whether we should, as a rule, concentrate more on fundamental research now, or rather on applied research, or perhaps on demonstration. It seems to me that in order to kind of, you know, get hydrogen off the ground, that we need to get the industry to a large extent on board, so that perhaps applied research and demonstration should be probably the focal point. But that's kind of my impression, but maybe you have some comments on that. Thank you.
There's great need in production, and there's great need in storage. Storage is this area which will enable sector coupling. So that is an area where we really need to focus a lot of attention. Some of the problems there have already been solved, I think, for the sector coupling application for gaseous hydrogen, but for hydrides, for small scale, volumetrically storage solutions, we need help there. In production, there's all kinds of places we need help. Let me just make a comment on demonstrations. You know, so because both basic and applied are needed. When I went to MBA school, there was a thing called OPM, other people's money. And so it's still other people's money, largely government money, that's funding things like demonstrations. For example, in Shell, in the Rhineland, in their refinery there, they have just commissioned a 10 megawatt electrolyzer, PEM electrolyzer. And so this electrolyzer has been in the works, you know, on the drafting table for 2 to 3 years, you know. Shell didn't put that up with their own money. They did that with FCHJU money, okay? So this is why things like mission innovation and the government funding efforts are really important, because they're the ones that are funding the demonstrations now. I mean, maybe now the Hydrogen Council, as it sees the future, will put more money into demonstrations, but largely they've been the province of government, you know, because there's no immediate return on the investment. But I agree with you, some of these are necessary, but with some of this technology, like electrolysis has been in use a long time. One of the biggest electrolyzer companies in the world, NREL, in Norway, was founded in I think it was like 1920. It was that era in any event. So these are long-term plays, and they're commercial entities. You know, they have a huge market cap. So maybe if the investment community calls for more cooperation, we can actually have more demonstrations. The oil and gas industry is uniquely suited to fund demonstrations. You know, I mean, because you have deeper pockets than, for example, the renewable energy industry. And that's what it's going to take. It's going to take will.
Question right there.
I had a question for Andy, and sort of tied back to storage. I mean, the 40% risk factor that the financial community sees in the big investments here, how much of that do you think is driven by storage? And shouldn't you be all over hydrogen as maybe the, you know, supporting that? You've got to have the demand in order to get the investment in the production. So it kind of goes hand in hand. If the demand is really clear, then Siemens and others are going to start to, I believe, invest more in electrolyzers and bring those costs down. Where's your industry on storage in general? And how do you see that as a risk? And why not get on board with Mary Rose?
I would say, first answering the risk question, the majority of the risk is really in the delivery of the project, the offshore environment, basically in establishing, operating it smoothly, installing it. That's where the majority of the risk lies. The risk is not necessarily seen into the storage delivery, because that's something which is more predictable. You can assess that at the beginning. But what you're saying, offshore wind should embrace hydrogen, I totally agree. And I think if one of the takeaways of this session is, I mean, everyone talks about wind, solar, offshore wind. I mean, everyone now starts to realize it's happening, it's feasible, it's actually competitive. So we're at that stage where we can go to volume. And I think hydrogen technology needs now the boost so that we get that message out. And it's a fantastic fit with offshore wind. Because if you have electricity, you can produce hydrogen as much as you like in a very proven way. This is not new technology. It's clean, so it makes a lot of sense, and it enables the renewable energy transition to actually accelerate, because we solve issues on transmission. And you mentioned storage is a topic for offshore wind. You're absolutely correct, because if you observe some of the offerings, a developer, very often they compete for a power purchase agreement, and they say, well, I need to do something more than just a good wind farm. Let me add some storage, because it just provides a more comprehensive solution to an energy problem.
Here's time.
I was curious, Marie-Rose, when we look at hydrogen and what's next for hydrogen, could there be some drivers on sort of cross-cut learning as well? I read about NASA, they kind of launched these shuttles into sort of space, and to my knowledge, there's hydrogen into them, driven them into space. So is there a potential to tap into that knowledge for the hydrogen industry, or is this too insulated, and is this just another monoculture that sort of deprive the sort of emerging hydrogen niches to actually excel from that experience? And my second question, you mentioned a lot of fuel cells, but what about hydrogen turbines? Is there a promise there? Just wonder if you could comment a little bit on this.
Then the first question about the space industry, this is a legitimate application for hydrogen, and we're actually looking at that. We're incorporating that into our safety work. We have a safety task, so we hope to incorporate the airline industry and NASA. The NASA, because it's a logical crossover. The use of fuel cells for life support systems was one of the first introductions of fuel cells in modern times. So, and then the second question, your second question, could you repeat your second question? Turbines. Oh yeah, well, sure. Gas turbines. All our friends at Sandia Livermore are experts in gas combustion, and certainly that's possible. You could even combust hydrogen now you could convert your ICE engine right now the same way they've been converted over the last 20 years to perhaps run on something else, whatever, you name it. They could be converted to run on hydrogen. So it's the larger scale combustion is possible. I think people are a little more, there's focus on it in an R&D level, but I think people are more focused on fuel cells, but it's certainly possible, certainly.
On the space travel front, SpaceX's DC office is just downstairs a few floors, so you should go knock on their door and try to get them to invest.
Okay.
And on the turbines, Snam, the Italian pipeline company, just earlier this year ran a test where they put 5% hydrogen into 2 industrial facilities, one of which was a pasta factory. So that with the idea that ultimately they would be making low carbon carbohydrates, low carbon carbs. So it wasn't a low carbon hydrogen; it was an industrial hydrogen. But it was a 5% into the mix, and it worked. No technical issues. They're issuing a report on that, and so there are opportunities even now to start getting hydrogen into the natural gas mix.
Right, thank you for bringing that up. That's really important because we have this huge asset all over the world with the gas infrastructure, the gas grid. And sometimes the renewable purists may say, no, we're going to skip right over gas and we're going to just immediately go to clean hydrogen. But it seems to me that who's going to leave this huge abandoned asset, a stranded asset around the world? So, but the point is that there's been a lot of work done in the gas industry. The gas industry has hydrogen in their DNA because the street lamps around the world used to be run by hethane, which is a mixture of natural gas and hydrogen. So the gas industry a lot of it's really comfortable with hydrogen because of this experience, which is decades old, but it's still very real. The regulatory frameworks around the world have different. They have different provisions relative to the mixture, the percent mixture. So there's the 5% you talked about. Up in Canada, Enbridge is doing another, they're doing a demonstration on 5% introduction into the grid. But 5% is a really low amount. So we're thinking that probably you could at least mix it at the 20% level without any issues. Sometimes the issues are not related to the use at the point where you actually generate the power. The issue is downstream with the appliances. For example, and this is important because the UK is the one that came up with the Leeds project, the H21 project, where they took a look at converting the Leeds gas infrastructure over time into like 100% hydrogen. But it would start with the conversion with gas. And the UK's financial analysis, the economic analysis of this was that it wouldn't cost the ratepayers any more money. So which was excellent news. Where they found there would be an issue with them that was thorny was downstream with trying to get all the toasters and this electrical appliance and that electrical appliance certified to run on a slightly different power mix. That was the issue. So, but this is definitely picking up all over the world, and we're hoping to actually work on that, and maybe we the hydrogen TCP wants to work on that actually with the GO TCP, the gas and oil TCP, and also with the greenhouse gas TCP. I mean, this is this is a very logical next step.
James, does hydrogen come up in any of your conversations when you're talking about finding opportunities to lower the carbon footprint in the oil field?
In the oil field, yeah, I think it's actually a great application, and particularly from a backup generator's perspective. We've seen a lot of, in particular, high safety process equipment. I believe heard about a lot of the telecommunications companies switching from diesel backup generators to hydrogen, just because it's you can actually store your fuel inside. It lasts a lot longer. And so I think that the backup generator perspective from the oil and gas would actually be great. But also, just to touch on what Mary Rose had mentioned during her presentation, is that there is this inherent combination between renewables and then hydrogen. So basically, when you have negative or zero electricity prices, it's a great place to kind of offload electricity. And we've done some studies that showed if you can offer even 10 cents a megawatt hour or $10 a megawatt hour to kind of curtail electricity, you actually have a drastically different build out of the energy system. So you actually end up getting a lot more renewables that then basically to get curtailed, but because they still have kind of a market kind of signal, you actually see a lot more of that. So I think there's a lot of synergy there.
Any more questions? Great. Well, thank you all so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. We'll take a brief coffee break right now, and then we'll come back for our final panel on regional perspectives and alternative energy investment. So thank you all.
and how a diverse and integrated and increasingly fungible energy mix has created this spectrum of energy investment pathways, both for countries, for companies. So I think it's valuable that we're concluding this conference with a conversation designed to place these choices back in some sort of regional context. To that end, we've assembled a pretty amazing panel for you today. We have Ross Tyler, the Executive Vice President at the Business Network for Offshore Wind, Vasilis Kunigas, the Policy Officer and the Directorate General for Research at the EU Commission, and IEA GOTCP Exco Delegate. And we also have Aubrey Hruby, Senior Fellow with the Africa Center here at the Atlantic Council. So I think between those three, we're going to have three incredibly different experiences. And to start, I'd like to turn to Ross to kind of kick us off with the North American offshore wind perspective. It was something that came up in the previous session. Obviously, U.S. offshore grown considerably in the last 5 years. Tell us, how does that fit into the future of the United States energy mix, but also contextualized by a lot of global offshore wind growth? Kind of how does that position the United States relative to the market that's becoming increasingly important?
Great, thanks. Well, good morning, everybody. I might just step aside here. I've only got 2 slides to share with you, just as sort of introductory remarks. But I think really what I'd like to do, just to sort of frame the conversation with respect to offshore wind globally and the position of the United States, which is that one could really say that over the last 30 years, looking back, the world has created about 20 gigawatts of offshore wind, primarily in Northern Europe. And IRENA has come out with a report earlier this year, which is forecasting that in the next 30 years, we're going to have globally 520 gigawatts. So it's an additional 500 gigawatts of offshore wind around the world. It's an exciting time to be involved in offshore wind because we have this huge growth. So where is the United States? Well, the United States is with only 30 megawatts of offshore wind at the moment. But 30 megawatts, and this is really the first offshore wind farm, which is off Block Island, Rhode Island, in state waters. And it's 5 turbines with 6 megawatt GE turbines. And we have been staying at this level for a while. And now, as you can see from this graph, we have this huge growth. And we have this potential of really coming up to the equivalent of what Europe has done over the last 30 years in a relatively short time. So my main message with this slide is to show that the United States is joining the rest of the world in an accelerated growth and embracing offshore wind. And we have a member, we're a not-for-profit membership-based organization, and we have a member who's doing some forecasting and anticipates that the United States by 2050 will be at around about 100 gigawatts. So we could be, as a nation, we could be with about 20 to 25% of the global offshore wind market. So this is where we are right now. It's a bit of a busy slide, but and just really to give you some sort of concept, we have to be careful with the numbers. We have to be careful in terms of how we define the pipeline. And the reason for that is that we have a disconnect in this country between the US federal government, which is responsible for leasing areas outside of the state waters, which is 3 miles and beyond. And right now we have 15 areas that have been leased by the federal government, which gives a potential of 25 gigawatts of area that could be harnessed for offshore wind. But then we have to actually rely on the states for the offtake. And the states are working on their own policies to secure the offtake agreements from the developers that have secured the lease areas in federal water. And we have we have really a potential where the states have expressed a willingness to take up to 20 gigawatts of offshore wind as an offtake by 2035. But at this present moment, as we sit here today, the state governments have committed to actually contractually buying 3 gigawatts of offshore wind. So we have to be careful with the numbers of the various stages of the agreements. We have a huge opportunity for job creation. And the other important point to notice is that the cost of offshore wind is coming down. And this is making it obviously more attractive. And with respect to the oil and gas companies, we are seeing a great potential with the oil and gas supply chain companies that are primarily based in the Gulf, having the skill sets and the assets, hard assets as well as soft assets, to contribute to this growing offshore wind sector. As you can see from the shaded areas, particularly in the Northeast, this is where the markets are. We do have the potential of the West Coast, but it's deep ocean there, so it's a different technology. And maybe after, if we have time during our conversation, we can come to this, because this will be floating offshore wind, which also is involving the oil and gas expertise. So at that point, I'll just probably stop and hope that gives you a bit of an overview of where we stand as a nation.
Thanks, Ross. I think we'll operate similar to how we did the last panel, where we jump in with the audience in and out. One initial question, and you kind of mentioned, this came up both in the previous session and you alluded to it here. When you have so many stakeholders involved, but both between federal leasing, state-owned transmission, how are those stakeholders working together? And is that relationship fluid? Is that helping to facilitate this growth? And if not, what kind of needs to be done at a broader level in order to help continue this massive growth we've seen over the past couple of years?
That's a packed question.
Yes,
so I'll try to give a very succinct answer. So you're right, there are a lot of stakeholders involved. We are primarily involved with the stakeholders of the policymakers, with the business community, and an area of focus now, which I think everybody has really sort of missed up to now, which is the general public. And I think as we get more and more offshore wind farms actually right on the verge of being built, we need to make sure that the public that are going to either see it or see the activity during the construction and operations and maintenance are comfortable with offshore wind. The other areas, of course, are the communities involved with the fisheries, and also with the environmental groups, and also with defense. I think defense periodically raises its hand and says that there could be a challenge with the radar issues. Fisheries obviously are concerned over their livelihoods. And we as the business network, we do not get involved. Our members have not asked us to engage with those two particular areas. But we are always mindful to engage with the environmental community. We talked to the environmental groups right at the early stages when we started doing some work in New Jersey. In the very early days, we engaged them, and 2 years ago we started working in California, which I hope we can talk about with respect to floating offshore wind. And one of the first things we did was to bring in the environmental community so that they could ask their questions and we could have a dialogue. And I think that we as a community, we business community, we always try to keep that dialogue going. Mm-hmm. Just to finish a little bit more about the transmission issue, the transmission is a concern now. I think, as a nation, we have worked sort of incrementally. We first spent a lot of focus on identifying the areas where we could actually deploy the offshore wind farms. Then we've been spending more time on working with the states on the policies for the offtake and power agreements. And now there is a concern about how do we get all of this potential power onto the grid when it wasn't actually designed for it. And that's an ongoing discussion, and we have a subcommittee that is trying to integrate the needs of everybody and to move that forward.
Any questions from the audience in which case I have another question. One of the things that you and I had talked about earlier was kind of couching U.S. offshore wind growth within a globalizing, rapidly growing U.S. offshore market. Where does the United States stand in terms of its relative position in that market? And are we seeing, at least some of the successes it's seen start to exhibit some sort of leadership, as the market continues to grow both in China and continues to grow in Europe?
I would say that the leadership role is more in terms of the potential of the market. I mean, one of the things that we have in the United States is scale and size. Some of the areas that have been leased by the federal government are enormous relative to the European offshore wind farms. And I think this is particularly attractive to some of the developers, the European developers, because some of the, should we say, the low-hanging fruit in terms of areas in Europe have already been secured, and it means that future areas in Europe, offshore wind areas, are further out to sea, which makes it more complicated and more costly. And we have basically fertile ground to be developed, but they are a scale, and it allows them to get economies of scale, and it does make it attractive for the supply chain, the established supply chain, to find partners in the US and to move into the US business community.
Well, since we're starting, we've moved on to Europe, I think this is a good opportunity to move to you, Vasilios. I know you have some slides, so we'd look forward to those. I mean, how, as a representative of the Commission, how is Brussels and the Commission positioning itself to help facilitate what we've seen as some really, really strong commitments across the continent to subnational renewables deployment?
Yep. So let me start to present some of my slides. I'm just going to give you an overview of how the EU sees the road towards the clean energy transition. If it works. Yeah. Okay. Then this is what we aim to achieve. We have very ambitious targets for 2030 to reduce our emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions, by 40%, and then to be number one in renewables, increasing our renewable shares to 32%, increasing our energy efficiency to 32.5%, and then we have long-term ambitions by 2050 to reduce our emissions by 80 to 95%. So this, we aim for complete decarbonization by 100% by 2050. This is to reach the target of 1.5 degrees global warming and not more. And for this, we want to have renewables first, but we need to address the remaining fossil fuels. And this, we believe that it needs to be decarbonized, for instance, through carbon capture and storage and use. So the remaining also fossil fuel power plants need to be flexible, because you have increased renewables in the markets, and they need to provide backup power. And this is where the nexus between oil and gas renewables for us is important in Europe to address these flexibility issues. And then, of course, you have the systems approach to address the different sectors, the electricity, the heating, the smart grid system, the transport, and also the energy-intensive industries. And for this, we need also sector coupling. So for us, for this nexus between renewables and hydrocarbons, this has been mentioned before. Hydrogen is a key part for the energy transition, but we don't only need renewable hydrogen, but we believe we also need low-carbon hydrogen through CCUS. And because hydrogen plays a very big role in the integrated energy system, such as power, heat, and transportation, also in the carbon-intensive industries like steel and the refineries, And then power-to-X and utilization of captured CO2, it's very important. So I believe, as you have said, the role of hydrogen is very important, and it will grow up quickly, at least in Europe. So for this, we have developed a communication which we call Clean Planet for All. It's a strategic long-term vision on how to achieve these targets and to arrive to a climate-neutral economy. So our target is to limit the global warming by 1.5 degrees C and to achieve net zero greenhouse emissions by 2050. The EU aims to lead in this battle towards climate change, and then to inform the others how can they achieve this without actually limiting the benefits of the economy. So it can be both possible and beneficial. So for this, we have developed 7 building blocks within this strategy. We aim to address different areas how to achieve this energy transition through energy efficiency, through renewables, and then, of course, we need to have clean and safe and connected mobility. We need to place focus on the competitive industry and circular economy, the infrastructure, interconnections, bioeconomy, and natural carbon sinks are important. But finally, these remaining emissions, which I mentioned before, can only be tackled with CCUS. So CCUS, we consider it's important for this nexus because it can be linked, for instance, with biofuels to provide negative emissions. It can be linked with the blue hydrogen or the low carbon hydrogen in order to provide the hydrogen that we needed for large scale, for instance, to decarbonize the steel industry. So it's a very important issue that we need to be addressed in order to achieve our targets. So the next step is we have started a dialogue already with different stakeholders, the European Parliament, the national governments of the member states, as well as citizen communities and the citizens. And we order to shape out this strategy in order to submit it by early 2020 to the UNFCCC as required by the Paris Agreement. So as I said, we need in Europe, we want to show leadership and to hold other parties to do the same in the battle of climate change. For this, we have created already an innovation fund, which it's a funding mechanism on how to tackle, to arrive to this strategy. This innovation fund encompasses the different energies, renewable energies, energy-intensive industries, energy storage, and CCUS. So this will be big projects that will be funding under these technologies, and of course combinations of these technologies. And for this, again, the nexus for this is quite important. We aim to have 10 billion euros to fund these different projects, and this will be supported by the EU emission trading system, which actually been revised and will start in 2021. So these projects actually will be funded based on innovative technologies, and then we have regular calls up to 2030 to fund these projects. So this table gives an overall structure of our funding in the European Union. We have the research funding for Horizon Europe, and then we create in partnerships. One of the partnership we aimed, of course, is the Hydrogen JU partnership, but we aim to develop a new partnership which we will call Clean Energy Transition. It will encompass the different technologies and how to link these different technologies together. We have, as I mentioned, the Innovation Fund, and then to fund the infrastructures, we have the Connecting Europe Facility, and also Modernization Fund, a Cohesion Fund. It has been mentioned already, the mission innovation, it's important, and there is a mission innovation, of course, challenge on CCUS, and again, the blue hydrogen, it is addressed within this challenge on CCUS. They had a conference in June 2019 in Norway recently. Then already has been mentioned the mission Innovation Challenge 8 on renewable and clean hydrogen. We aim for the bigger projects on hydrogen, and both renewable hydrogen and low emission hydrogen is being addressed in this challenge. So for us, for research at least, we have the Horizon 2020 that is ongoing and is enabling technologies for the decarbonization. We're now developing the Horizon Europe, which aims to have a cross-sectoral approach, and again the nexus between renewables and hydrocarbons can play a role for this. So the discussions actually are ongoing. We have already a call in Horizon 2020, which I mentioned already, on flexible operation of fossil fuel power plants. This could be a good example for the nexus. This actually gives the overall structure of Horizon Europe. We have 3 pillars, and we have several clusters, and the cluster that corresponds to the energy is the climate, energy, and mobility cluster. The total budget is 100 billion euros, and to aim actually to fund very likely the big budget for low carbon technologies. Overall, for climate and energy mobility, we're going to give 15 billion euros. So this is actually the cluster for climate, energy, and mobility. You see they have several areas, which includes the energy storage and energy supply, under which are the main issues for these technologies. And for the energy supply, this is mostly linked to CCUS and hydrogen, whereas in the area of, this is the area that focuses more on the energy storage and the batteries, because we want to actually create, as you may know, recently the Battery Alliance, in which actually we focusing on the EU efforts on a different focus from what is done in the rest of the world. We're focusing on sustainable battery life cycle and how these batteries can be produced sustainably and actually recycled also sustainably. So that will be the focus of our next research program. And of course, we will continue, as you have mentioned, our research on near zero emission carbon hydrogen, including fuel cells and the EU value chain for design and the end use. Yep, thank you.
Thanks, Vasilios. One item which you mentioned, you touched on briefly, that strikes me as an issue that Ross, you mentioned as well, is with the electrification of everything, with the arrival and rapid deployment of renewables, we're noticing a real need for grid development and transmission. That strikes me as a natural fit for a body like the Commission to support. Where does that fit into this strategy?
Sorry, I didn't. Okay.
So where does grid development and cross-border transmission fit into these ideas?
Yes, as I mentioned in my presentation, we have already an ongoing activity on the grid development, and we have this funding that is included. So this, and then we have targets to meet within different member states into how to harmonize the grids. But also, I don't know if you're talking about infrastructure or pipelines. So
primarily infrastructure.
Yeah. So for the infrastructure, of course, we have topics which covering mainly the pipelines. But recently, we also included in this the areas of hydrogen pipelines and also CO2 pipelines. So these are also eligible for funding under this cross-border pipelines infrastructures.
All right. Any questions from the audience? We got one right here and one right there.
Great list of activities. We should try to adopt the mayor. Where we just take your slide and send it to the White House. But in the CCUS, you've got an investment in the U part, the utilization. What are some of the things that you're investing in for utilization other than storage?
Yeah, on CCUS actually we are. It's a topic that interests many EU member states recently, because, as you know, we have some problems with public acceptance in Europe, and also financing big storage projects. So yeah, CCU is gaining momentum very much in the EU. There's still the question how much this can contribute to our targets for reaching our climate targets. We are convinced that we will make a contribution, but of course it's not a big contribution we're expecting from CO2 storage. But nevertheless, we're looking for other activities, for instance, even direct air capture close to the industrial sector. This is also an activity that we'll be looking at.
And we have one right here.
Maybe I missed this. So do you see hydrogen being price competitive along with, after CCS, do you see it being price competitive with natural gas, or as for steel plants for to coal? And is that something going to be more like a ban on? How are you planning to make them price competitive for countries?
Well, as far as I know, the hydrogen that is produced from natural gas is price competitive now. So I think the plan is for at least, because we need large quantities of hydrogen. For instance, if we want to decarbonize the steel industry, then to use this blue hydrogen in the transition stage, and then once the cost for renewable hydrogen goes down, and then we'll be able to produce more renewable hydrogen in bigger quantities, then to continue with that at a later stage. So that's the plan, really.
Any further questions before we move on to? All right. Moving on to Africa, a part of the world that's in a considerably different place in its energy development compared to our previous two panelists. But nonetheless, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, an area with huge projected energy demand, immeasurable natural resources, and fundamentally a lot of opportunity. But with all of those opportunities comes a huge spectrum of opportunities and choices, from gas to power to energy access to localized grid development. Aubrey, I'd be curious if you could kind of start by explaining, out of the entirety of decisions that the continent and the subregions have to make, what approaches are working? What investment alternatives are around and available to these countries? And I guess also importantly, how should the oil and gas community, as a community which has long been a part of Africa's energy story, be approaching its involvement in this transition?
Sure, thank you so much. I get the great challenge of trying to cover an entire continent. That is, you cover a continent as well, but in 1.2 billion people in 54 countries, and without a commission type structure that you can say, what is the continent doing on this? There's not any entity that can kind of speak for that. The African Union doesn't have those kind of coordination powers, et cetera. So I will jump to country level to speak through kind of some of the diversity you're seeing on the continent. I would say that decarbonization is not a word that's used regularly in the African context, because it's in development and most of the issue is around energy access. So huge numbers of people do not have access to electricity regularly, and that's the concern. And so it's incumbent on all stakeholders to get the lights on, basically, and that's true. Every country has power deficits on the continent, even South Africa right now, if you're following what's going on with Eskom and their financial challenges, rolling blackouts, et cetera. So normally I say Sub-Saharan Africa ex-South Africa, because South Africa is quite the exception to the rule on the continent, but even in this case, they're having power access issues. So you have the traditional oil countries, so in Nigeria, Angola, Sudan, Ghana now, the whole Gulf of Guinea area. You have emerging gas power, so Mozambique, Tanzania, folks who are sitting on large gas fields that are not yet developed in any meaningful way, but are enormous. Senegal, Mauritania. So the LNG facilities aren't yet fully operational in even Mozambique, which is further along. And then you have countries that are just devoid of traditional kind of hydrocarbon assets. And so in each one of these places, they have different challenges when it comes to their energy choices and energy mix. Let's take the largest, let's talk about Nigeria. So Nigeria population 200 million. Certainly power is the number one constraint on growth. Nigeria is growing luckily maybe at 2.5%, which is less and slower than the United States right now. And the only way they can reduce poverty is to increase growth, and the only way they can really fast track growth is to get the lights on. And so there are structural issues in terms of getting power to the people that emanate around the kind of credit worthiness of the distribution companies. So they are generally discos, the distribution companies across the continent are bankrupt, if not, and not credit worthy. So if you can't build on the back of that. And so there are a lot of interventions that have been kind of mobilized by the donor community to try to figure out injections into the structural fabric to try to make distribution companies more credit worthy. Gas to power is a big focus, but getting the gas to where you need it in Nigeria is a problem, and gas availability is a problem. So I went to a dinner a year or two ago in Nigeria during the Forex issues when they were having really constrained access to foreign currency. And I don't know who was less popular, the central bank governor who was dealing with the Forex issues or the head of Owando's gas unit, who, and all the industrialists in the room saying, where is my gas? And so most people have, Nigeria as a country has 60 million generators. And diesel is what you're really competing against in terms of the energy sources. So the business models that are at play here are in kind of two camps. One, captive power. So if you talk to most developers and investors, they're looking for captive power opportunities. So industrial power where you have some pretty big off-takers. And then secondly, off-grid renewable. And you've seen iterations of kind of business model in the off-grid renewable space. I think, you've seen or popularized some of the kind of like village solar, like at-home little solar things. That's still going on, but it's not making a big dent into the overall power system challenges. And so you have now what are more like, there are a couple interesting models of micro utilities, whereby the government, for example, in Nigeria, there's a company called RenSource, which they get a concession from the government to cover an entire market. So imagine a very large outdoor indoor market, where there's 10,000 kiosks of little sellers. And prior to this company coming there, each one would kind of share generators. So you three would share a generator, and then you three, and everyone kind of, figure out how to do that. And the diesel guy would come around and deliver. And so what they said is, okay, this whole market's going to go to solar. And instead of sharing generators, you're going to just buy from the solar. And then you'll have kind of a mobile phone payment collection system. And you can then get into some pretty significant numbers for the use of that solar. And so, for example, this company can put up solar in an entire market where there's 1 million people foot traffic a month and 10,000 kiosks. So they have all of a sudden 10,000 little users. And then there's other things you can do with that. So they can do market by market by market. And so those type of models are coming up, where then they develop the market solar through an SPV, and infrastructure investors can invest in that. And then the company that actually collects and does the tech aspect of it can be venture type company. And so you find some different forms of financing that you can see in these type of models of getting power. You had asked about the role of traditional oil and gas companies in the renewable space, and frankly, there's too much for them to do in terms of ensuring the sustainability and viability of their own assets. Sure. I don't think anyone is necessarily pushing them to kind of invest in solar right now. That's not, I mean, the bigger concern is, for example, in 5 years, there's less than a 5-year horizon for when Nigeria needs to negotiate its next offshore licenses. So a lot of the companies are holding back investment, and until this like political uncertainty around their licenses will ease. And so it's things like that. I mean, there needs to be a lot of investment into the actual oil and gas assets. And in the countries that are not yet extracting and actively selling to the market, I mean, huge investments need to move forward in LNG and other things in the gas space. So I don't see any pressure for them to be very involved in renewables. I think there's a lot of entrepreneurs who are involved in renewables, and there are a lot of funds. The challenge on the continent as a whole is that there is a lack of bankable projects. So there's quite a bit of money sitting out there in very large funds looking for projects. But because it's a continent divided by 54 countries, many of them lack scale. They're very, very small. You know, stark statistics are only 3% of the global population lives in small landlocked countries. 33% of Africans live in small landlocked countries. That means that like cross-border and these type of things for power projects to get to scale become very important, and there's not necessarily the intergovernmental mechanisms for that. And so you find that there's just a lack of financially viable projects. And so that's when you see the donor community, the traditional development partners being more involved in energy, which is definitely the case. All the development finance institutions that focus on Africa have pretty significant energy interests and energy portfolios. Some are innovative in that they're just topping up tariffs. So, you know, for example, government wants to keep power prices low for a variety of reasons, political including, but you have the actual economics of producing power, so you can't do it economically. So what if, you know, the government agrees to pay you 8 cents kilowatt hour, and then, you know, KfW, the German organization, tops up to 12, which makes it viable for you. So there are some kind of programs like that that really engage with the private sector. And then other programs are very focused on the systemic issues. You know, how can we better design power purchase agreements? What are template forms of these kind of things? What are the policies that need to be in place around the distribution companies? You even see Power Africa, which is the U.S. Africa priority program under Obama administration around power, was, you know, very focused originally on new connections, and you see them having evolved to focus a lot on distribution and transmission. So seeing those two areas as more of the concern rather than generation, because you can get private sector money into generation if the other parts of the system are working. So you do see that. You see the Millennium Challenge Corporation also focus more on distribution and transmission, and because they're trying to get the other pieces. The World Bank has done massive work in Nigeria in particular, trying to backstop the distribution companies so that they become more creditworthy. So all these interventions are taking place at any given time. There are a lot of people believe that the energy choice for African countries is not or, it's and. And you do see a lot of off-grid renewables going because it's just faster, easier to get going than expanding the grid and dealing with all the other problems. So I think it's going to have a very robust energy mix. The question is, can it be fast enough to satisfy the needs, the aspirations of the youngest population on the planet and rapidly growing population? And that's a challenge for what's happening. So I do think that needs to be, you know, no one knows the answer to that. And it's urgent. It's incredibly urgent. It's something that people want every day. So with that, I'll take questions.
Yeah. I mean, any questions for Aubrey? That was quite a lot to chew on. I have several of my own.
Yeah.
Let's go here.
That was a great review in just a few minutes. I was wondering whether you thought there was the opportunity here for renewables really to jump ahead, and maybe we can keep a lot of that energy in the ground. Is there any potential for that?
What you have seen is South Africa has done an incredible job of rapidly increasing the renewables portion of its energy mix. And they did it through a series of very targeted, very prioritized RFPs. So a very kind of thought out program for increasing their renewables platform. And they did, up to their current mix is something like 40% renewables. And they did that and they went from like 5 to 40, something huge, because they were able to do that from a kind of procurement perspective. Other countries haven't had the same kind of political framework to do that right away. And I wouldn't say it's necessarily because like oil and gas are lobbying otherwise. I don't think anyone is, there's no one on the opposing side for getting more renewable power online, because again, we're talking about deficits here. People are without. So it's not a trade-off where someone else loses. I think it's just a matter of country capacity to focus on those type of things where your expertise is. A lot of the oil countries, the traditional oil countries, have a significant number of oil engineers that have been trained over the years, right? And they're familiar and fluent in the language of kind of continuing to build out the carbon space. Nigeria in particular is home to several indigenous Nigerian oil companies that are well known and staffed. So I think sometimes it's lack of understanding, but then at the same time in Nigeria, they've had this renewable energy agency, and it's led by an amazing woman named Damiola, and she has just charged ahead with like all kinds of new programs, because in some way people are like, okay, yeah, you run the renewable thing, okay, nice, and she just let her it gave a lot of political attentions on big kind of oil and gas licenses. Whatever she was doing in renewable was not as much interest, right? So it gave a lot of freedom to push forward some innovative models. So again, I think it's a country by country basis, but there's not, to make large scale solar, there's not a whole lot of examples of where that's worked yet outside of North Africa.
Let's go here.
So how do you so really great discussion. Do you see Africa or certain countries just sort of following the similar type of architecture that the U.S. has in regards to transmission and distribution? And can you talk a little bit about how the Chinese are playing? They have ambitions to build nuclear plants. They're building the T&D on top of that.
Two of those things. I don't think anyone thinks that Africa's energy solution is going to be replicating what's been done in Europe or the U.S. I think there's going to be a hybrid, a mix of things, because building out the grid and building out distribution in traditional ways just is going to take too long. And so the question is, how can you do that in established cities? And yes, making sure that the grid that's working already, because there's big problems already where, like for Turkana wind project, we were speaking wind in Kenya, for example, for at least a year or so was not able to sell all of it into the grid because the grid couldn't handle it. It couldn't carry the power. Mm-hmm. And you see that in a lot of cases. So grid can be a big constraint. So in that space, everyone has a view of it having a mixed, that you'd have some renewables, you'd have utilities that are completely self-sufficient. There are people experimenting with direct-to-consumer solar for your home to power your TVs, your not just like your village home light, but to power all the electronics of a modern middle class. So there are models that are experimenting with that. So I think it's a mix. The Chinese have done some work in energy on the continent. It is true that they are by far the largest foreign financier of infrastructure in Africa. But a lot of that infrastructure has been in transport. So transport, ports, rail, road. Those have been the kind of big chunks. And then in energy, the area that they've looked the most is in hydro. And partly because of the Three Gorges Dam and that experience, they've looked at and they're finding hydro. And so you do see some work in that, but then hydro, of course, where you put the dam is determined by rainfall, et cetera, and then you have to figure out the grid and everything else. So I haven't seen the hydro programs that the Chinese, or projects that the Chinese have been interested in, move as quickly as the transport. And even though China is larger than all the other donors put together when it comes to financing infrastructure, it's still only financing maybe a little less than 20% of Africa's infrastructure financing need. So the 80% is going unfinanced, more or less. And the infrastructure need is just insane. It's even insane relevant to, compared to other developing countries. So when if you compare, say, Nigerian infrastructure to Bangladesh, or other similar levels of GDP per capita, et cetera, African countries are under, this is ex-South Africa, are under infrastructured, basically. There's less investment in infrastructure. So infrastructure writ large is a huge problem, but the Chinese have mostly focused on transport. That, and a little bit of hydro, river hydro. But you haven't seen them creating giant power plants. That's not been an area that they've been very engaged in. Sinopec is there in some places, and yes, it's come as a result of other projects. So Sudan, I would look a little bit more. Angola, where they have deeper footprints from an oil perspective. But generally, they're just buyers of on the oil side, and then even on the infrastructure side, when they make it, they tend to it's build own transfer. They don't actually run the ports. When it's not like Bolloré Group or Maersk or something where they're staying there over time. They build it, and then because it's financed by China through an intergovernmental loan, so then the government of Kenya would take on the debt to finance the rail, and then once the rail's built, it's owned by the government. So it's not run by the Chinese. That's typically the model.
There's
one over here too.
All right, we'll go to you. No, it's okay. I'll take a moderator privilege. This question of scale, you keep mentioning it's a country-by-country problem, and you continually have this problem of scalability. Are there any success stories out there which could at least provide some lessons learned?
Yeah, I mean, there are, for example, there are sub-regional power pools that are getting more interest and more investment. So West African Power Pool, for example. But again, a lot of the West African power pool was predicated on the idea that Nigerian gas would flow into it, and there'd be kind of surplus gas to then come into the power pool. It turns out that there isn't surplus gas, that they need to use it locally. And so now when Ghana comes, Ghana will probably be more likely to feed into the West African power pool. There have been some good examples of power sharing and power transfer agreements between Ethiopia and Kenya. Ethiopia, because it's mainly a hydro country and dependent on hydro, has some of the cheapest power in the world, somewhere around 4.5 cents kilowatt hour. So the joke is the cheapest way for Kenya to get power is to invest in Ethiopia. And to continue to have the big dams projects that the Chinese did, in fact, help build in Ethiopia. The Gibe Dam projects was a Chinese, to your question, a Chinese dam project. And so that selling power across the border between Kenya and Ethiopia has worked out well. And it's just because Ethiopia has such hydro assets that it makes sense for that. It's still early days to talk about the gas fields and what they'll mean once they're fully developed. Mozambique is sitting on a gas field. It's as big as Qatar. So, I mean, you're dealing with huge gas assets that will have huge relevance in 10 years.
That's great.
Africa Kilowatt is the company I'm involved with. Compliment you. That is the most comprehensive and concise description of the issues I've ever heard.
Well,
a comment and then a question. We advise African utilities on purchase power agreements, and we're doing with the Chinese a 50 megawatt solar, 25 megawatt battery microgrid in Nigeria. 80% of the funding's in hand. what is the central purpose of the Africa Center, and what are you guys trying to accomplish, and what do you look for when you come to a session like this? What kind of takeaway are you looking for?
So we at the Africa Center is a center of the Atlantic Council, just like we have folks who focus on the Middle East and Latin America, et cetera. So the Africa Center is been around for about 10 years. We focus on all issues related to kind of security, the political frameworks. I personally only focus on the economic aspects, so I lead up all research on investment, business, trade aspects of Africa here. So yeah, our mission is to inform policy both on in Washington, but in African capitals, but also to write about. I've spent the last 18 years advising investors on the continent, so I'm not a full-time think tank person. I personally also invest in African markets. I invest in the tech startup space. But I've worked with very large corporates across the continent, and then African governments as well, who are seeking partners to fill. There's just a lot of tragedy, the common issues where you got to kind of concierge a deal and bear it to make it work in these contexts. So yeah, those are the hats that we wear, but we're trying to inform good policy on either side. And love to hear a little bit more about the solar, because Chinese haven't done too much solar on the continent, though they are involved in every solar project globally, if you think about it, because the solar panels are all generally made in China. And you know, my friends who are in the solar business in Africa, they will say, I mean, similar to what you were talking about, they're not in the solar business, they're in the battery business. If you can't figure out the battery aspect of it, then forget about it, right? So they spend a lot of time looking at the different battery options that are viable for these solutions. And to Vasilius's point, a lot of this innovation is spilling over into mobility. Because we're talking, Africa will be home to 3 or 4 of the world's largest megacities. And mobility is a massive problem. The productivity that's lost from sitting in traffic, I mean, the Beltway has like nothing on this stuff, right? So it's really a question of how can you move massive populations for the work. When I'm in Nigeria or spending, I mean, my driver, he will leave his house at 4 in the morning just to get downtown to pick me up around 7:38. Like, it's a 3.5-hour commute each way. I mean, people's lives are ruined by transport. So the question is, how can you then do these things? So there are a lot of people looking at electric vehicles and doing pilots of electric vehicles, and those go from the tuk-tuks, or what are in Nigeria called KKs, to motorbikes, so motorcycles. There's probably been $50 million invested in the last 4 months in Nigeria in terms of motorbike ride-hailing, so Uber for motorcycles, these type of things. But the question is, can they be electric? And so if they can be electric, you know, if you've got these markets that are these giant micro utilities, can they also be charging stations? So this is where like a lot of the entrepreneurial thinking is going, and entrepreneurial energy is in the intersection between energy and mobility.
And then almost to your point, you know, the Chinese investment actually came up earlier, and particularly if you're talking about batteries and storage, that's an area where China has historically, you know, played a huge role globally, and likely wants to play a similar role, if it isn't already, in Africa. Just to kind of put a bow on this, you know, Vasilios, you have, you know, Europe trying to exhibit some leadership in this space with things like the European Battery Alliance. When you look at a country, when you look at a region such as Africa that's looking at electrification of so many of its sectors, mobility, commerce, et cetera, do you think there is a role for Europe to play through institutions or agreements such as the European Battery Alliance to take advantage of what is clearly a growing, if not huge, opportunity?
Yes, as I mentioned in my presentation, Europe has started doing work later than other countries like China or Korea. So we're not going to this direction to compete to compete with these countries. We're looking for a different model. We're looking for, as I said, for having a sustainable use of batteries, and probably to use not the usual raw materials, but develop new materials for the batteries. Maybe to have also more sustainable mining, and also to see how we can recycle these batteries in a more efficient way. So looking from a different point of view, so we aim, as I say, leadership towards this domain, towards the sustainable use of batteries, rather than developing or competing with the existing advances in these technologies.
But that said, Europeans are, so for example, the Renewable company I was telling you is using German batteries right now, and they looked at American ones as well, different lithium types. The solar panels for sure, no, I mean that's all China. The electric vehicles that are being experimented with are either Chinese or Indian. There are quite a few Indian ones being experimented with on the continent right now. And then where European leadership has been most seen in the energy sector is in some of the infrastructure funds, renewable funds. The investment is coming and being pushed out, especially by European DFIs. They have done a lot in this sector. So, for example, even the company, Rensource, that I was just talking about, so if you look at their investor base, I would say the majority of their investor base is European. So that it gives you kind of a sense of how those pieces come together. Again, U.S. and European countries, I mean, we're mainly service-based economies and financial centers, these type of things. So are we going to be mass-producing solar panels? No. Like there is some aspects of playing to your competitive strength. The Chinese are financing infrastructure, but that's often very different than investing in the same way that European or American companies do. And I think it's unfortunate that in English we use a catch-all word of investment that doesn't break down these particular types of flows to make it clear to compare apples with apples, because the models are very, very different. So what the U.S. can do in African markets is very different than what China. We don't do government-to-government financing of infrastructure in the same way. We just don't. We don't have the mechanisms to do it. We have the Millennium Challenge Corporation, but that is grants-based, okay? So we do give grants for infrastructure, but it's grants. It's not debt in the same way. Most of the investment that takes place out of U.S. government, like development finance institutions, DFIs, same with European DFIs, is government to business. You have to invest in a project or in a company or in a fund. That model is different than what the Chinese model is, where it's a government-to-government agreement and then a contractor is paid to execute. Those things are, and so they operate differently. We're going to have different strengths and weaknesses, and often there's a question of how we compete. I think we have to break that down a little bit better onto what we're good at, what they're good at, what the mechanisms are. Otherwise, it just makes for a messy conversation.
To pivot slightly to a thread that kind of emerged repeatedly throughout the past 2 days and came up in the previous panel as it relates to offshore is the nexus of both offshore and hydrogen. I want to turn to you now, Ross, because I know this is an area that you had particularly identified as an area of interest for your work. When you look at kind of the comments that have been made by Vasilios on Europe's hydrogen goals and your expected growth for U.S. offshore, what role do you think hydrogen has to play both in the, let's say, the medium to long term, if not the short term?
Well, I'm grateful that you raised the question. I was actually going to ask you, if hydrogen is ever discussed on the continent of Africa. But because really, I think here in the United States, it's still not at the forefront. It hasn't really reached the same level as it has in Europe, and it's great to hear. And I concur, the gentleman's left, but we should take your slides and send them to another building in DC. But I think hydrogen for the offshore wind sector has huge potential. We have a member who is doing some research on electrolysis using offshore wind. And of course, there's some advantages, technical advantages, because particularly if you're using it for floating offshore wind, because then you've got deep oceans and you've got cold water deep, so you can actually use the natural resources, not just the wind to actually create the electricity with which to create the electrolysis, but then you've got the cold water underneath to help with the condensation, which will all contribute to the economics. So we're seeing floating offshore wind as being, if you like, the next wave of technology. And we would like to have, certainly for the United States, a discussion, a more inclusive discussion where floating offshore wind, I mean, everybody talks about lowering the price. We're trying to have a way of increasing the value. And we think that hydrogen, having floating offshore wind pegged to hydrogen and a hydrogen economy, particularly off a coast like California, which is the 5th largest economy in the world, and with its present Senate Bill 100 going to completely renewables or completely clean energy by 2045, we think that there is going to be a demand for hydrogen, whether it's for transportation or whether it's for hydrogen cells or for heating for heavy industry.
I mean, and that's a fair question, actually, to Aubrey. Hydrogen, may or may not have an immediate role in Africa's energy future. But are there any sort of those bigger, broader renewables project, whether that be floating offshore, that kind of can gain any traction, or is Africa still focused really on the hard and sort of issues related to just getting power to the
I
people?
haven't been in a single meeting on African power where hydrogen's mentioned. I mean, they haven't gotten the gas out of the ground. Like there's so many other priorities that seem to be pressing in a way that and resources of government capacity to manage a variety of issues and priorities is stretched in many countries. So no, I mean, wind, there's some in Cape Verde. There's obviously this wind project in Kenya that's well known. South Africa's looked. So wind, yes. I mean, offshore wind, I haven't heard a whole lot. I know that, I mean, there's some discussion of it for sure. But again, I think that most of the countries are trying to figure out, first and foremost, how to use the sun and to capture solar, figure out river hydros, figure out old dams that aren't producing at the levels they are, or what's going to happen when rains change and the hydro resources that are been there for 50 years are not producing at the same level. So those are more the type of issues that I hear more of.
Then I guess, Ross, so a second point you had made regarding floating offshore, what's the time scale look like for that? In OECD, in the United States, in North America, or even, Vasilios, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on, on European offshore. I mean, offshore wind's been a consistent theme here. How is Europe thinking about offshore? So we'll go to Ross and then Vasilios.
Well, I might just steal your thunder a little bit by saying I think Europe floating offshore wind is far more advanced than we are here in the United States, which actually disappoints us in the business network for offshore wind. I was coming out of a meeting in December, not last year, but the previous year, so 18 months ago, in the south of France. And one of the companies, that's actually SBM, had just won the award to put a floating offshore wind demonstrator in the Mediterranean. And they were particularly celebratory, and deservedly so, because they shared with us that they had actually secured this when competing with 55 different technologies. 55. And it comes back to my point in my opening remarks. Here in the United States, I know of 3 technologies, 3 floating technologies. And so where are we? Where is the United States in this new market when it comes to floating? And I would say that we are disappointingly slow in coming forward with our technologies. I mean, I'm convinced, even though I speak with a strange accent, I I have an American passport. I've been here for 33 years. I've worked with the business community. I know that the United States has a great deal of innovation, particularly in the oil and gas supply chain around the Gulf of Mexico. And somehow we need to bring these resources. We need to bring the federal resources, the technical resources out of the academic institutions, out of the national labs, and have the states embrace this and bring the technology so that, frankly, we have our own technology being produced in the United States. Because as I mentioned, offshore wind is a growing global market, and we have export opportunities. And there is no reason why the United States shouldn't take a leadership role when it comes to floating offshore wind.
Vasilios, obviously Ross, very complimentary of Europe's offshore wind thus far. How is Europe thinking about offshore strategically? And then, bringing up the issue of supply chains, is there any appetite for, some sort of alignment or agreement or partnership between, Brussels and Washington on, developing these supply chains for offshore wind, which clearly are growing areas of renewables investment for both parties?
Yeah, as Oscar mentioned, the offshore wind is a priority for Europe. We have already big projects, big demonstrators, as you mentioned, in Scotland, in France, or even in Portugal. And now the big companies like Equinor, they're looking to invest in the Mediterranean. So yes, it's one of our big priorities, and it's one of our priorities to achieve our energy transition. So in terms of cooperation with US, I must admit, I don't know how this is ongoing at the moment. There are probably opportunities under the mission innovation to look into that. But in terms of the big investments and the demonstrators and pilot projects, I think we're talking about cooperation between companies in big projects. So that's a different domain after that, I think.
I'll throw it out to the audience for questions one last time. We have one right here, James.
Just had a question in the African context. I know that you had mentioned that oil and gas kind of companies were basically overwhelmed on kind of going renewable with other issues. Do you see the same trend in the mining industry? And then I guess that would also kind of kick it out to the other members of the panel. Is that this is some of the rare materials and kind of earth materials going to be important to offshore wind or other kind of development kind of pathways?
So a couple things. I would say, maybe I don't want to be mischaracterized. I think the oil and gas companies in African markets aren't necessarily overwhelmed with opportunities, but they do need to build out, they would like to build out additional opportunities in their sphere, right? But in comparison to opportunities, say, in the Gulf of Mexico or other areas, they're very interested in North American assets as well. So if you look at the whole Anadarko, Chevron, Occidental kind of bidding thing, that wasn't for their Anadarko's Africa assets. Let's be frank, that wasn't what was driving the interest in them. I think in addition, the oil and gas companies would complain often of less than best practice in the kind of regulatory framework. So again, around keeping uncertainty around offshore licenses in Nigeria, letting it go under 5 years is bad for the industry. So they're not happy about some of those things. Likewise, the mining industry in more regulated mining countries, so here I'm talking about South Africa in particular, faces challenges from a regulatory or structural aspect. You'll remember all the labor issues that plagued the mines in South Africa, platinum mines in particular, and many of them have slowed growth due to regulatory challenges. When it comes to rare earths and some of those metals, the distribution is more Congo-oriented, and that the issue there is not necessarily rigid. The regulatory environment is a more loose or less understood regulatory environment. And the Chinese have quite a bit of play in Congo around the rare earths mining. And there's concern globally around supply chains, right? So are these conflict minerals? Dodd-Frank law makes you kind of track your supply chain and understand whether these are conflict minerals or not. That adds a cost of compliance of sourcing to these things. So some of the investment is not built out because it's more costly from a global regulatory perspective, and then kind of a lack of regulatory oversight in the actual country. So I think it's different based on different minerals. And then, of course, gold mining in West Africa, that's the kind of ebb and flow of investment in the space is very tracked to gold prices. And those are very traditional type mining operations, old mining operations. So it's a mixed bag when it comes to the mining space.
I guess, Ross, on your point on that.
So with respect to the rare earth and metals, I mean, we are aware that these are used within the turbines themselves, but as I mentioned right at the beginning, we've only got 5. So it's not really high up in terms of our sort of thoughts right now. I am aware that in Europe there is a program in the UK where they're actually trying to devise a new turbine that is less dependent on rare earth metals. But I think from our perspective, you know, we need, I mean, we are dependent as a nation, we're dependent on imports of the turbines and will continue to be so, I think, until we've got a more robust pipeline, confirmed pipeline. And we're there. I mean, we're coming. It's in the making. But I would see that it's at least, you know, 5 to 8 years away before we even have that sort of potential pipeline to start thinking about having a manufacturing of turbines in the U.S.
I think, Vasilios, yeah, I mean, it was something you mentioned as well regarding the European Battery Alliance in particular. Sustainable mining, you know, rare earths, playing a role. It's the common thread throughout all of the renewables technologies we've been talking about. How is Brussels, you know, dealing with this issue in particular, either specifically within the European Battery Alliance or as a broader strategic point?
Yes, this was one of the reasons that we have created this battery alliance, and actually to investigate and to do research on new materials, so to get away from the rare earths, and that's our objective, to develop new batteries which are not dependent on rare earths. Yeah. So we'll be continuing to invest on this, on our new program in Horizon Europe, and actually we have already published some topics of research already in Horizon Europe, in Horizon 2020, and we'll continue to do that in Horizon Europe to invest in these issues. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. Any further? Yes, Dave.
Thank you, Reid. Just a question on Africa and use of domestic gas, if again, or gas found offshore. There have been you mentioned some giant finds, but to my knowledge, most of this gas is sold out to the world market. It's not used in the country where it's found. But if it's so, I was just curious, in your mind, what is the business case currently with the state-of-the-art technology and econometric infrastructure to actually use this endowment to mitigate energy poverty in Africa? And the second question, can the world community, such as the World Bank or other, help lubricate that transition to get, the African economy is using that gas a little bit more domestically, or is this totally demand, lack of sufficient demand?
I'm not an expert enough on all the different projects that are going on in Mozambique and Tanzania on the gas, but my basic understanding of the issue is that massive investments need to be made in pipelines to bring it onshore. There is, or you can take it and regasify. So there's been a view that that is secondary as you're investing. Let's sell to the market, get revenues to government. Government could invest in a variety of things from education to power to other things while you're building the infrastructure. So I don't think all of them want to be energy independent. I mean, most of the countries, so for example, when oil prices go down, one continent hurts really badly. And then another part, the oil importers benefit enormously, right, from what they have to pay for their forex and their foreign reserves to buy oil off and buy energy products off the market. So the countries, everyone wants to have that opportunity. I think it's just, I mean, when I was looking at Mozambique's requirements for the gas fields and and realizing, I mean, it was upwards of $13 to $15 billion. And the Mozambique government itself was going to have to put in, you know, 3 to 5 billion of some sort. And then this is right when they went into a debt crisis. So, and to your question on World Bank, World Bank's very involved in these areas and trying to figure out how to help the country, help the countries involved do macroeconomic navigation and good footing to be able to borrow for the assets and to figure out, okay, of this, the Chinese want to finance this much. Of this, you know, World Bank will finance this much. How can we sequence it? How can we put this project together that makes sense? But most of the governments have, because in many ways they borrowed against these assets. They need to get revenue from them as soon as humanly possible. So if that involves selling to the international market immediately, then so be it.
Any further questions? One more here.
Just 2 parts.
Yeah.
2 parts is fine.
Okay, one, will the is there any way the slides could be available or posted? Okay, number one. Number two, you talked about hydro, but you didn't mention the Inga Dam. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so Inga in Congo is a planned dam that would, you know, in a variety of estimations, could power basically the whole continent, is the view, right? And it's a massive dam project that's been talked about for, I think, last time I looked, something like 40 years. You know, I think those of us who spend time in investing in African markets, talking to investors, et cetera, I think there's 2 types of investors. There's ones that are like, oh, don't even mention Inga to me. Like, it's so pie in the sky, like this thing is never going to get off the ground, et cetera. And then there are others who are like, no, we just all need to double down together and make it a reality. And there's tension between the two that see it as a pipe dream, especially its location. There's a view that given the challenges that the Congo has had historically, and even around elections and Eastern Congo's stability and ongoing, now they're fighting Ebola in Eastern Congo, that the idea that you're going to have a framework that can govern a project that will need international financing in the billions of dollars is going to be a long, that's just a bridge too far. That's what that camp would say. And then the other camp would say, well, we all need to come together in the international community and make this thing happen because its potential is so large, and you can compare it to Three Gorges in China, and you can't build industrialization in the continent without it, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, you know, it's just I've heard a lot about Inga, and you don't see a lot of movement. So it's hard for me to see that path.
I haven't followed it since a year ago, announcement by Bloomberg about
None of that is materialized. I mean, the challenge around infrastructure type investments on the continent is that, especially when they're announced from the Chinese side is that there's not necessarily always a lot of checking on how that's progressing or the numbers. Because in 2007, there was major announcements in Congo about a Chinese deal for resources for infrastructure, where Congo would be basically trading resources for the infrastructure. And that was a $9 billion project then, and it didn't get done because it was stitched together, a bunch of agreements, and there's aspirations for it. I know that when Raj Shah was leading USAID, Inga was something, he was in the camp of like, we all need to come together and make it a reality. What does it take? Versus the people who are like, no, let me just go build my solar here, or that off-grid here, that, like, Inga's never coming. So I can't, unfortunately, pick one of those, but that's the discussion. It's always seen as a holy grail for energy in African markets. Then hard to imagine that if it were to come online, that the grid, that the transmission, that the distribution would all be there at the same time.
Any final questions before we break? All right, I think with that, I'd like to thank our distinguished panelists. And then being that this is the last panel of our conference prior to lunch, just on behalf of the Atlantic Council, thank you, Jostein, thank you, Andre, thank you, IEA, GOTCP, and your entire EXCO. This was a lovely series of conversations, and we look forward to having you again next year if possible. Thank you.